Hello, hello, warriors. So I hope you are doing well. Today we are going to walk our way through most of the rest of the French Revolution, or at least the first of the French Revolutions. Hopefully you kind of grasped from yesterday's work that the French Revolution happens to be a very complicated topic. And I'll be frank, guys. Normally, when I teach this in class, I use a documentary to teach it. Because the documentary does the whole French Revolution in about one class period. Whereas when I do lecture notes on this, it's usually with an AP level class, and those notes take days. So the French Revolution is really complicated, and I just need you to know that I'm grossly oversimplifying this, okay? If you are interested in this topic, which it's fascinating, frankly, if you're interested, I can recommend a million different resources and a bunch of different documentaries that you should probably watch. However, given the fact that I need to keep these lessons relatively concise for you, I'm going to do my very best to finish up the rest of the revolution today. Tomorrow you'll be looking at Napoleon and the European response to the revolution. And then on Thursday you will be... hang on. No. That is Thursday. Sorry, I'm like a day in advance. Then on Monday, you'll be talking about the Haitian Revolution. So I'd planned on getting to the Haitian Revolution by the end of this week, but alas, when I got into it and kind of really looked at what content I needed to cover here, I needed to add in another day. So my apologies. So let's go ahead and get started. So based off of yesterday's work, you should have an understanding of some of the causes of the revolution, which hopefully you understand involves everything from poor crops, a really rough winter, poor financial management, an outdated class structure that gave far more privileges to the wealthy and to the church than to common people, and that very unfairly distributed tax burdens to the poor. And you also know, hopefully, that Louis XVI was a pretty dang incompetent leader. He was not a very good monarch. So let us now talk about Louis continuing to make poor choices. So here we go. So when last we spoke, the Bastille, the prison at the heart of Paris, had been stormed. They'd started tearing it down. The sans-culottes, the people without knee breeches, they had murdered the guards at the Bastille, and the National Assembly back in Versailles had drafted a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this declaration was sort of akin to the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It declared these values and principles that were really important. And the National Assembly wanted Louis XVI to sign it, but Louis refused to. He refused to acknowledge the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen because it gave people too many rights and it limited his rights. Because in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, it specifically says that no government exists without the will of the people. And that flies directly in the face of everything that Louis believes as an absolute monarch. He is afraid that the Declaration is going to limit the rights of the nobility, limit the privileges of the church, and he's absolutely right. It sure does. So, when it becomes clear that Louis XVI has no intention to actually sign the declaration, people in Paris are furious. Remember, Paris had been surrounded by soldiers. Paris had been the heart and soul of a lot of bread riots. And in October of 1790... in October of 1789, this group of heavily armed common women from Paris. They were members of the sans-culottes. They were part of the third estate, but very low-ranking third estate members. These women were... they were known as the poissons. They were called the fishwives. They worked in a fish market in Paris. And so they were these big, strong, working-class women who were very good with knives because they spent all day like chopping fish and everything like that. And they marched from Paris to Versailles, which was 12 miles away. And when they got to Versailles, they banged on the gates of the palace and they insisted that they be allowed to go into Versailles. Now, they did this for a number of reasons. One, they were very, very angry that the king refused to sign the declaration. Number two, there were rumors saying that within Versailles there was a stockpile of flour and Marie Antoinette was sitting on it and just kind of like hoarding it all, which was not actually that untrue. Versailles had a huge amount of flour and the rest of the people really didn't. So these are women. These are women who can't afford to feed their families, and they're furious and never get in the way of a whole bunch of angry working class women who can't feed their families, because they tore down the gates of Versailles, they murdered the guards, they chopped off their heads with their knives, they stuck their heads on pikes, and then they proceeded to have a puppet show with the beheaded heads around the windows of Versailles. They broke down the door to the palace. They ran through the hallways. They started screaming for the queen. Give me the queen. I want an arm. I want a leg. Quite literally, they were going to rip her to pieces. They run into her bedchamber, but the queen isn't there. They tear her bed to shreds with knives. And eventually, they force the royal family into a carriage and they accompany them back to Paris. And they're like, you live with us now. You live in Paris where we can watch you and where we can keep an eye on you. And the whole National Assembly moves to Paris as well. And they basically abandon Versailles. The royal family will never go back there again. Now, the royal family lives in another palace in Paris. They live in the Tuileries Palace, but they're essentially under house arrest. The sans-culottes within Paris will not let them out, and they are basically made to kind of jump to the whims of the revolution. So, with the royal family now under their control and the National Assembly now in Paris, the National Assembly gets a little bit more radical. They don't just draft a declaration of principles, now they draft a declaration of a constitution. They draft a constitution which is going to officially limit the power of the king. And they force Louis XVI to sign it. And since he's basically now under the control of the mobs in Paris, he has no ability to fight back against them. And so as of 1791, when the Constitution is ratified by the National Assembly, France is now a constitutional monarchy, and the power of the absolute monarch in France is officially limited. So this is an engraving of the March to Versailles, the Women's March. You can see that these are some working class women. They are strong. They stole cannons, and they dragged them 12 miles on dirt roads to kind of intimidate the royals. You can see below the image, it says, à Versailles, to Versailles, to Versailles. Yeah, they're the reason why the king had to move to Paris. It wasn't men, it was women. So during all of this, okay, during the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, during the writing of this new constitution, during the forced march of the royal family back to Paris, the rest of Europe is watching. They're watching France, and they're watching France sort of erupt within itself with violence. And Europe was a really competitive place in the 18th century and the early 19th century. And they saw this weakness in this great powerhouse of Western Europe as an opportunity. In particular, two of France's major rivals, both Germanic states, Austria and Prussia, decide that they're going to take advantage of this and see if they can carve away some French territory for themselves. Plus, both Austria and Prussia were ruled by absolute monarchs. The Emperor of Austria was an absolute monarch. The King of Prussia was an absolute monarch. And they didn't want their citizens getting crazy ideas about, rights and constitutions and things like that. They didn't want the revolution to spread. This is a theme you're going to hear a lot in this unit, is that revolutions are they're like viruses. They're highly contagious and they spread very, very fast. Ideas spread faster than people do. And so what they want to do is they want to keep the ideas of the French Revolution contained to France. The best way to do that is to put the king back on the throne with all of his absolute powers. So the Austrian emperor, who also happens to be Marie Antoinette's brother, decides that he's going to invade into France, see if maybe he can steal a little bit of territory for himself, but then he can also put his brother-in-law back heavily onto the throne and get rid of the National Assembly. So initially, French soldiers are in a massive state of disarray, partially because a lot of the officers from the French military had been nobles, and many of them were fleeing the country as the revolution became more and more radical. So there weren't a whole lot of people in charge of the military during the early days of the war. Plus, the famine that was striking the common people all around France was also affecting the military. An army marches on its stomach. You have to feed the military, and there wasn't enough food. So, and if people can't feed the military really can't fight. So early on, the French military faced astounding defeats, one after the other. And it very likely could have been the case that Prussia marched directly into Paris and put Louis XVI back up on the throne with all the powers and privileges of an absolute monarch, and poof, the revolution was over. So when it looked like this Austrian-Prussian alliance was going to end the revolution, people in Paris panicked. And what they did was they arrested everybody. The sans-culottes arrested everybody who was understood to be a royalist sympathizer, anybody who wanted to put King Louis XVI back up, in an absolutist sort of way, and they executed them without trial. It was extrajudicial killing, straight up murder, and they killed about 3,000 people over a course of a weekend. It was incredibly, incredibly bloody. However, the French military managed to hold off the Austrian-Prussian alliance, at least for the moment. And this victory, as weak as it was enough to kind of change the national morale. And to commemorate these victories, you had a number of military marching songs and all sorts of stuff that were written, including the current national anthem of France. So if you ever watch soccer games or the Olympics, and the national anthem of France comes on, it's dun 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 dun. You probably know the tune, yeah? The lyrics to that song include, "Let the blood of our enemies water our fields." The French national anthem is metal. It is impressive. It is a good national anthem. Now, okay, so the Austrians and the Prussians are invading into France. Louis XVI and his family are basically held as prisoners within a palace in Paris. They've had to give up their traditional absolutist powers, and so Louis is like, this is not cool, God said I could rule, and so he decides to try to launch a counter-revolution. In order to do this, Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and their children decide to escape Paris. They disguise themselves as the bourgeoisie, which is kind of like the middle class, which they thought they were pretty, sneaky about it, but it's hard to disguise yourself when you're the king and your face is on the money. So he tries to escape Paris, and the goal is to make it to the Austrian border, which is north of France. Just kind of roll with it. I know that's not where Austria is today, but it was then, or at least part of Austria. Just kind of accept it. And the idea was that as soon as they crossed into the Austrian territories, Marie Antoinette's brother could give them some supplies, and there would be loyalist military officers waiting there, and they would launch a counter-revolution against the existing revolution. However, only a few miles from the Austrian border, they are caught in a town called Varennes, and they are arrested. The king is arrested. They want to see his travel papers, and he shows them. He's got the travel papers. They're in order. It's like showing your passport. The travel papers are actually signed by the king. Nobody's travel papers were actually signed by the king. And then the guards got a little suspicious, and they kind of looked at the guy, and they were like, he looks familiar, and then they figured out he was the actual king, and they arrested him and brought him back to Paris. Now, when you try to flee your own country as the monarch during a time of war, that's treason. So the King of France is charged with treason against his own country, and he is stripped of his title. And I'm going to stop here and then pick up in the next video.